Hello everyone and welcome to today's lecture on Discourses of Security. Today we're going to look at security as speech act, and we're therefore going to zoom in on a concept that has been quite popular over the last decades, especially in the analysis of security in Europe, but also has made its way into political discourse, and that is the concept of securitization. The concept of securitization is very much related to colleagues in Copenhagen, and therefore you see the Little Mermaid in this picture on the first slide. We're going to get back to the Little Mermaid in a moment towards the end of this lecture, because it's related to one of the sympathetic but critical engagements with this idea of security as a speech act. Before we start, let us recap again last week's lecture. Last week we looked at security as emancipation. Emancipation, we thought of freeing individuals of all constraints and thus the enabling of individuals to make their own choices, political choices, private choices, economic choices, etc. Such emancipation was a core concern, I argued, in critical security studies, critical with a capital C. And we will see today how different approaches, how different understandings of security laid claims to be critical, but not critical in the sense of critical security studies that lined up more explicitly and directly to post-Marxist understandings of security. This critical security studies recognizes the power-knowledge nexus, recognizes how any representation of security is imbued with knowledge on the one hand and power on the other hand, and how knowledge fosters power and power fosters knowledge. And therefore, there are questions about not security as such, but also already representations of security. How security, say in Pinar Bilgin's work that we looked at last week, how security in the context, say, of the Turkish domestic political discourse is represented within particular so-called geopolitical truths, which are, however, constructed at that very moment. This idea that security is not actually a given, but is imbued with particular power and knowledge is actually something that we're going to return to today. Like human security, critical security studies we saw move security away from the state to the individual. So in that sense, it is close to human security, but gives it a much more critical twist. It is not so much wedded to a liberal understanding of individuals, of history and human life. However, there is an issue about how critical it can be without attaching itself to such an alternative vision. And of course, the idea that it is in the end the individual that is supposed to be emancipated does go back to the Enlightenment and the insertion of the individual subject into the course of history. And of course, that may not be shared by others. And therefore this idea of emancipation is also criticized. Criticized in the sense that perhaps what is going on here is the emancipation of the individual in a sense that is a particular Western construction of the individual. This emancipation has been taking place largely through the delegitimization of traditional security practices, and therefore the strengthening of the role of individuals in security discourse. However, it's been weak on the actual guidance towards alternative political actions. In addition, as I already now outlined, there's an unclear relationship with liberalism. To what extent is this a critique of liberal conceptions of security, or is it actually part of a broader liberal agenda to free the individual of structural constraints? More recent developments of critical security studies, now with a small c, in a broader understanding of what critical may mean, have therefore also led to a questioning of the idea of emancipation as a goal or being part of security. And in many ways, this gets us now to the subject of today, the idea of security as speech act. Now, what we will see here is that there is some dispute over the critical nature of this particular discourse of security. But at the same time, my argument will be that this presents us with a critical alternative, yet a critical alternative in which things like emancipation are defined in very different ways from the Booth, Aberystwyth School kind of understanding of emancipation. So far in this lecture, we have largely looked at substantive understandings of security. The discourses that we have looked at have made particular claims about what security is in ontological terms. It is emancipation, it is national defense. So very, very concrete meanings were attached to the concept of security. In contrast to this, today's discourse of security as a speech act is agnostic towards what security actually in substantive terms is. Instead, it argues that what security is constructed through speech acts, and that is why we call this the security discourse as a speech act. For such a speech act to count as what is now called securitizing, to be a securitizing speech act, it is not necessary that it actually utters the word security. Instead, what we will see is that it needs to follow specific rules. It needs to have particular elements. It needs to, as Ole Wever once called it, to have a particular grammar to it. As such, this discourse now confronts us with a formal discursive rather than a substantive definition of security. So we're not defining security in terms of what it ontologically is, but we're providing a formal, a discursive definition that can be filled now with different kinds of content. This understanding of security, this discourse of security, is widely associated with the so-called Copenhagen School of Security Studies, and in particular with the work of the already mentioned Ole Wever. It was him who actually introduced this idea, and very famously he once wrote a working paper that's never been published as such, but the title is still very much in use, in which he actually spoke about security, the speech act. Today's questions, therefore, are: to what extent can we call security a speech act? What are the effects of that speech act? What are the effects of securitization? And how does it differ from politicization? Is security really only a speech act, or are there other things? And obviously, this will be something we will have to return to next week when we talk about security as practice. Who is able to speak security to whom? What are the potential risks of analyzing securitization? To what extent is this an emancipatory discourse, or is it perhaps, as some critics have said, inherently conservative? To what extent is it applicable outside democracies? And we will see that we will encounter a whole set of other questions in this rather large debate that has unfolded. So basically, what we're looking at today is one of the really dominating concepts in security studies in Europe. And you will find, if you go to Google Scholar or to the library or whatever, you'll find endless books and contributions to the debate supporting or critiquing the understanding of security as a speech act in many different ways. So what does this mean, security, the speech act? In the first instance, security is, in this sense, a representation. A representation is a linguistic representation of something or someone as, firstly, and these are the three elements that need to be given for a speech act to count as a securitizing act, a representation of something or someone as an existential threat. This existential threat is a threat to a particular referent object, and it justifies extraordinary means. This is the sort of structure of that speech act. It invokes an existential threat, a threat that is supposedly threatening the referent object in a very substantial existential way. It is talking about a referent object, and what is very interesting here is a debate about whether that referent object needs to be given or not. I would say it is consistent with the idea of a speech act that that referent object is not necessarily a given. It is rather inserted into the discourse through the invocation in this particular speech act. So if the referent object is the nation, and there's a threat to the nation, it is not that this nation is a given, and it is rather that through articulating the threat to the nation is reinserted, is constructed within this particular speech act and reinserted into the broader discourse. And this justifies now extraordinary means. War, it's a classic case of an extraordinary means. No one would say, in most cultures anyway, that war is normal. People have made arguments about violence perhaps being endemic in some societies, and have argued that therefore this idea of war being extraordinary is sort of Eurocentric. But I have to say that I find that very a strange kind of argument. Of course, there are warring tribes, etc. But still, the use of violence is in most societies something that is not legitimized on a daily basis. Even in warring societies, I would say that the going to war is extraordinary to the extent that it's got to be legitimized. You've got to legitimize why you kill these people. Now, as I already indicated, there is a difference between securitization and the individual speech act. The invocation of the existential threat is as such a securitizing move. So the speech act is a securitizing move. This securitizing move only turns into securitization if it is shared by the broader audience. So a securitizing move as such is not yet securitization. Securitization is if the audience accepts that move, if most of us are agreeing that there is this existential threat, that there is this referent object, and that these extraordinary means are being justified. And so this already gets us to some problematic aspects of this concept, and that these have been debated in the literature a lot. One of them is the relevance of the audience. So obviously, if a securitizing move is not yet securitization, then there's got to be an acceptance by the audience. But who is the audience? Very often there are articulations of existential threats to referent objects where it's not quite clear to whom they are addressed and who is actually to accept those moves. And also, the other thing that this raises is the status of the speaker of security. So who can speak security? If you go into the literature, most studies of securitization processes will look at parliamentary debates and will look at the degree to which there is securitization evidence there. Or they might go to internet sources, but these sources are largely governmental sources. So there's a heavy bias towards politicians. Of course, over the last years, this has perhaps slightly changed, but still there is a certain bias, I think, towards official sources, governmental sources. And so the big question here is it only government that can speak? This will be, again, something we'll have to return to next week when the role of so-called security professionals is much more emphasized. So there is a lot of debate about, who can speak security and what's the status of the speaker within their societies. What's important for now is that there is this differentiation between the securitizing move on the one hand and successful securitization on the other hand, when the audience actually accepts the securitizing move. And again, as I said, this is a formal rather than a substantive definition of security. It is a definition that provides particular criteria when a particular speech can be seen as a securitizing move, and it then provides some criteria about when the securitizing move is actually has turned into securitization. This also means that while it is widening, it does actually pose a formal boundary to what can be called security. So it's not engaging in just expanding security to other fields. And one of the reasons why the concept had become quite popular, and at least for Barry Buzan was one of the concepts that together with Oder then he engaged in, was a fear that with the widening moves and also with deepening and looking at the human as a referent object of security, all fields in politics become security, and that therefore the concept would lose its analytical purchase. And that therefore one would have to think about what is actually security and what not. And the answer to this in the Copenhagen School is the idea that security is a speech act that follows particular rules. So there are, of course, all sorts of other speech acts, but if it's a security speech act, it has to satisfy these three criteria, or it has to invoke these three elements. The one of the existential threat, the one of the referent object, and the one to justify extraordinary measures. In that sense, you can see securitization being partly directed against the ideas of critical security studies, but also of human security, where in the end, through the focus on everyday threats, through the focus on the individual, some people have argued that the widening has gone so far that it's not quite clear anymore what is security and what might be politics. However, I would also say, though, that the Copenhagen School is not particularly coherent there, because I don't see a particular reason why they would per se reject the idea of the individual as a referent object. If you read Buzan and Weber, they make arguments about the fact that security can only have groups as a referent object, and many people have criticized this. It seems to me that this is not a logical consequence of the original definition. If the securitizing move represents the individual as a referent object of security, and if that is widely accepted, so if human security was a discourse that was widely accepted in international society, then certainly this would be an effective securitization. So while on the one hand I think the criticism of analytically speaking of critical security studies and human security for not having a clear idea of where the boundaries of security lie is well taken, but that should not be confused with an ontological statement about who can and who can't be a referent object of security. And I think that Buzan and Weber, when they go down that line, are wrong, quite frankly speaking. Now, this whole idea of security as a speech act, of course, presupposes that we have an idea of what a speech act is. And I suppose many of you will know this better than me. If you study languages, and in particular in linguistics, this is something that is sort of stable part of your education. The idea of speech acts, and the one that actually Weber does reference in his work, comes from John Austin, a British philosopher who in one of his lectures that were, when he was already dead, then posthumously published, this lecture was about how to do things with words. And basically, one of the main arguments of this was quite similar now to what the argument about security is, namely that speech doesn't simply state objective truths. It doesn't really just state, what is there, what is reality. It doesn't state that security is this or that. In fact, it turns something into something else. So it is doing something. And there are some very obvious examples in Austin's work. A classic example is, christening a ship. I baptized this ship to be called whatever, Queen Mary or something. This is obviously an act that doesn't describe reality. It is an act that's very obviously doing something. Now, most of the time, speech acts are not so obvious in what they do, but this would be an example in which it is very obvious. At the same time, there are things like, if I pledge something, or if I apologize, all of these things are clearly acts, and they're not simply descriptions of what is happening. As such, in Austin's terms, speech acts are locutionary acts. They possess a particular meaning. They do something. The literature then distinguishes between two kinds of locutionary acts. Those who are called illocutionary acts. These are acts that perform an action in and of themselves. And then there are perlocutionary acts. These are acts that are only complete if the ones who are addressed actually are compelled to do a certain thing. Now, you would say, for instance, that if I pledge that this lecture is not going to take too long, this is something that is independent of you doing something. And I can already tell you that I'm probably lying if I say that. But most other statements, isn't quite so clear. So, for instance, if we look at the christening of the ship, of course, to some extent, is an illocutionary act because the name is then there by putting a bottle of champagne, crashing that on the surface, and now this is called Queen Mary. But on the other hand, if we come to think about it, there's of course also the issue that Queen Mary is only Queen Mary if everyone else addresses it as such. People could say, well, that's actually not the real name. Yeah? So in theory, one could actually say even there the audience might not agree. And in that sense, sometimes illocutionary and perlocutionary acts are not that easy to distinguish as, in the ideal type. They look. And this is relevant because in the whole debate about securitization, it is not entirely clear whether the speech act is an illocutionary one or a perlocutionary one. And strictly speaking, I would say that securitization would actually always have to be a perlocutionary would imply a perlocutionary force, because at the end of the day, it requires the audience to accept and therefore also change their behavior, to accept the speech act of security and then draw conclusions from that. And for instance, agree that extraordinary measures are necessary. But if you look at the literature, very often this is not really the focus of empirical research. People look at parliamentary debates, so they look at the securitizing moves, the speech acts themselves, and they take them to be securitization. So if in Parliament most people agree with or articulate a particular threat as an existential threat, etc., then they take this to be a securitization, which would sort of imply that the focus is on the illocutionary force. Now, that gets us into the intricate debates about securitization, but I wanted to alert you to this particular problem. So following from this, it's clear that security is not an objective category. It is discursively constructed in speech acts that follow particular rules. And we can also now add that it is not unproblematically good. It is not a good that is to be achieved. Now remember, in national defense or in emancipation, or for that matter in peace, in each of these discourses, security is a good that is to be strived for. So you wanna go and work towards such security. Here, security is not good. In fact, desecuritization, the Copenhagen School would argue, is desirable. And why is that? Security is problematic because, for one thing, in invoking this existential threat, there's a certain degree of urgency. An urgency that would mean that we have to take decisions, and if we need to take decisions urgently, we cannot really discuss and deliberate and think about this in very complex rational calculations or whatever. So this urgency is problematic for the political processes. And therefore, Weber argues that, in a sense, security is, if something is a security issue, it is outside the realm of normal politics. So normal politics would mean that the normal rules of political deliberation, for instance, apply. If something is security, they cannot apply because we've got to now do something. We cannot really start discussing. We cannot follow the normal procedures. So therefore, the argument is that, in a sense, describing or constructing something as a security issue is actually taking the issue out of normal politics. It is therefore depoliticizing the issue, or in other words, it would move it to an extreme form of politics that at the same time is depoliticizing because it undermines the normal rules of the political game. And that's problematic, of course, especially if we assume for a second that this normal politics is a democratic form of politics, or at least some kind of rule-bound form of politics. And thus it often legitimizes, therefore, politics that would otherwise not be legitimate. Now think about Corona for a second. There are measures that are legitimized that clearly, under a year ago, people would have not been able to even imagine a situation where they would be bound to be back home and not go out, where holidays are cancelled and factories need to shut down, etc., etc. These are clearly extraordinary measures, and they are clearly extraordinary measures that have to be legitimized, and they are legitimized through securitization, because there's an invocation of an existential threat, a very clearly existential, a physically existential threat, the coronavirus. The problematic aspect of this is, of course, then, and this is why this is debated now, and this is why there are calls for easing the lockdown, etc. Is the problematic thing is that this is not seen under normal circumstances as a legitimate kind of policy. War isn't in the same way, and of course all these allegiances between war and the fight against corona. Then what also is at stake here is that in many of the securitizations, this threat is associated with particular groups and other that is therefore marginalized within society. So if you not follow the securitizing move, you are taken to at the border of you're assigned to the border of the political debate and not really taken seriously. But more so, it is also an extreme form of othering that is even destructive towards that other. We need to destroy the threat so that it doesn't come towards us. And of course, in in history, the idea of war is a legitimization of destruction, extinguishing the other that is threatening us. And so the logic of securitization as a form of an extreme form of othering is therefore quite problematic in many ways. And so for Weber, therefore, security is a problem. It's not the solution. It is not what we should strive for. It is something that we need to be cautious about because of its effects on the political debate, but also its exclusionary, marginalizing forces. I do want to pause at this moment for a second and look at the antecedents of this theory. And I think this is important before we go on to quickly talk about the debate that has unfolded over security. And the reason why I think this is important is because if we look at the theoretical and historical context, I think some of the later accusations or criticisms do not make much sense anymore, and it becomes clear that perhaps they are more to do with the way in which securitization has been applied and has been used by other people who've taken up the concept, etc. But most of these issues that are often at the heart of these critiques are perhaps not inherent in the definition of the concept itself. Now, politically speaking, a lot of parts of this argument relate to the political debates of the 1980s, in which Weber was politically socialized, and they very much relate to the Cold War and the NATO double-track decision to station Pershings and cruise missiles in Europe. And you will recall that, you won't recall, but you may have heard in your history lessons that this was a moment of intense political debate, but where there was a hegemony of the political elite that was very much in favor of the NATO double-track decision, and where the protesters were seen as undermining the security of the nation, of the West, of the liberal way of life. And it's this experience that partly made Weber think about the processes that lead in the political debate towards the marginalization of particular views. So why isn't it okay to openly debate about the stationing of these missiles? Why does it have to be such a confrontational kind of argumentation? Why is the atmosphere so much an atmosphere of accusations, exclusions, marginalizations, etc.? And so the observation of how this political debate unfolded is very much a historical background and an interest in the negative aspects or consequences of security. Likewise, there is a theoretical and academic, so if you want, in Busan's and Hansen's terms, the Cold War and the 1980s with the return, the revival, if you will, of the Cold War were part of the events that influenced the development of this discourse. This one now, the second antecedent was more internal to the academic debates, and this was the development of the so-called fourth debate in international relations, and in particular arguments that were put forward by post-structuralism. For post-structuralism, of course, as you know, the focus is on the textual construction of reality, the discursive construction of reality. It is about how meaning in texts are constructed predominantly through difference, how these differences are not stable as the structuralists would argue, but have to be rearticulated constantly. And in those rearticulations, there are slight movements. There are movements of difference that then changes meaning perhaps slightly and opens up also the possibility of change. The argument that these differences that construct that meaning are often binary, and that they work through a privileged side and then the underprivileged side, if you will. So self is privileged versus other, but we cannot talk about self without the other. The concept of self doesn't make sense without the other, and vice versa. But in that pair, in that dichotomy, the self is privileged over the other, and the other is a potential threat to the self. In international relations, of course, this translates into questions of inside and outside, in Rob Walker's famous terms, and into questions of order and anarchy, where the inside is the orderly one that needs to be protected against the anarchical outside. And we already discussed parts of this when we talked about Richard Ashley's work and the criticism of neorealism in the lecture on security as national defense. So these binaries are value laden. They are often invoking these threats. The other is a threat to the self, the outside a threat to the inside, anarchy a threat to order. And so identities, to talk about nations, to talk about any identity really, is requiring that difference. Identity doesn't make sense without a difference, without an other. If there was no other, if there was no external, if there was nothing to distinguish the identity from, it wouldn't be an identity. And this difference is often articulated via threats, and therefore we can read securitization, the speech act of a securitizing move, from that lens as one of the practices that establishes such a difference and an identity. This is one of the reasons why I believe that the idea of the referent object must be constructed in the speech act itself. If you come to think of this particular contextual background of Weber's arguments, you cannot assume that referent objects are given. Securitization is a typical and perhaps extreme, but nonetheless very typical process of othering that inscribes the identity of the referent object by articulating this existential threat. And it does so then reproducing perhaps, in the sense that those differences are not given and need to be articulated. So it reproduces that particular identity. But we cannot take those identity to be an ontological given, something that we can take for granted. It is at least reinserted, if not constructed, at the moment of uttering security. One famous book in this context was David Campbell's Writing Security about US foreign policy and the politics of identity. And you can already see from the title that this aligns with this post-structuralist thinking. It's about writing security, and writing is in a sense a code word of a textual practice of inscribing security, constructing security in the broader discourse. And obviously this is about identity as well. So Campbell's book is really about how through foreign policy practices an identity is being constructed, an American, a US-American identity. And this foreign policy works through the articulation of threats. This is why it is a practice of writing security. And if you go and have a look at Campbell's book, you can see that this works then in several policy sectors. It works in history and frontier thinking. It works in the Cold Cold War against the Soviet Union, but it also works in the drug war, where the drugs are not a problem of domestic structures. The drugs are a problem because they are, of course, coming from outside and threaten the healthy nature of the American people. If we take these antecedents and take them seriously, I've already indicated some of the consequences that this may have. But clearly one of the consequences is, ironically, that this discourse about security as a speech act is putting forward an understanding of security that it is probably problematic because it focuses too much on the individual act. And my argument would be that this only makes sense if we see this as these acts as parts of broader discourses. So my own view would be that in many ways the idea of security as a speech act and drawing too much on Austin's work is actually problematic. And that central is not the individual speech act and its illocutionary or perlocutionary force. It is rather the degree to which this is shared. And a shared speech act is more than the force of the act of speaking. A shared speech act ultimately takes on a structural quality. It embraces society at large, and therefore I would actually prefer, if we talked about speech act as discourse. But Ole Wever actually was in Tübingen in this lecture a couple of years ago, and he very much insisted that he thinks that it's speech act, and he actually argues that he even comes more and more to think of security as a speech act, and so I think we perhaps ought to stick for a moment with that label, even though I think this label may be a misnomer, and you can already see how this makes a difference perhaps if you look at speech act or discourse. One thing that we have to discuss next week, because when we look at security as practice, it goes into similar directions. One thing we're going to have to discuss next week is the question of responsibility. And clearly one advantage of talking about this security as a speech act is that such a speech act has an actor. So there is someone who speaks security, and therefore this actor has or bears responsibility for this act. So the allocation of responsibility, and therefore the allocation of responsibility for all the problematic consequences of speaking security, is much easier if we conceptualize security as a speech act than if we conceptualize security as discourse, which is of course a lot more diffuse. So in discourse it is not so easy to identify the responsibility of particular speakers. It is rather the responsibility of a collective, perhaps. And so that makes it a lot more difficult. Say, if migrants are being securitized, if we see this as a social discursive kind of phenomenon, that makes it a lot more difficult to allocate responsibility, rather than if we say, okay, here is this particular right-wing politician who started a particular debate about migrants as a security threat. At the same time, of course, the question is whether that allocation of responsibility is responsible in the sense that perhaps it washes the broader society that may have replicated and bought into this discourse. It washes them free of the responsibility for the exclusionary consequences of that speech act. So I think this is a complex normative issue that I think is at stake here. What I also want to highlight as a consequence of these antecedents is that I would see securitization clearly as a critical theory. It is a critical theory about how referent objects are being reinscribed, how in this process how particular actors, particular groups are marginalized, how particular measures are not really part or should not be part of the normal political spectrum of policies, but they are actually legitimized through those securitizing processes. So all of these things, I think, mark securitization, mark out Securities and Speech Act as a critical engagement with security. And again, one of the consequences then further is that there are, things like, audience that is important, but also a conception of what normal politics is. So there is a clear bias, perhaps, in a lot of the work, including Weber's original work, towards a kind of even Habermasian understanding of a liberal form of politics in which there is an open debate, etc., and that this is then constrained through securitization, which of course raises a lot of questions about whether this is a theory that is only applicable to Western societies and perhaps privileges particular forms of politics over others, without understanding that these forms may themselves be problematic. From the view of the theory, as I already argued, because securitization is problematic, security is problematic, the political aim should be desecuritization. It is therefore a political aim to move subjects away from the realm of security back into normal politics, and the ideal therefore in Weber's terms is a situation of asecurity. He once wrote a paper about Europe as a community of asecurity. Perhaps you have seen this in the Barnett and Duval book on security communities. Barnett and Adler book on security communities. And of course, again, there are questions about this that you could ask. You could ask to what extent that is then the idea of a kind of technocratic politics that is sort of a politics in which there is no real passion, there are no big debates anymore. Is that the ultimate aim? I don't think so, but I think there's a certain risk if we strip politics. If we strip security from politics, that this results in such a technocratic debate. So perhaps one of the issues, one of the problems, and this has been very much discussed, is that each form of politics needs a degree of securitization. Without securitization, you cannot put something on the political agenda. Look at climate change. You needed to securitize climate change in order for it to be on the political agenda, because otherwise people would have never really talked about it. And so the question is whether in the Copenhagen School, in the notion of desecuritization, perhaps this boundary between security and politics is put in too stark terms, because maybe it's not a clear-cut boundary. Maybe this is a continuum, and maybe in all forms of politics there is at least a degree of securitization. So the political goal of desecuritization is perhaps not a goal to get rid of security completely, but a goal of moving an object, an issue, away from the pole of extreme security towards the pole of politics. Lene Hansen has proposed a number of ways in which this is actually done, or this could be done, and she argues that it can, for instance, be done through forms of routinization, of stabilizing particular security interactions, that they become normal politics. And this is part of the reason why I believe that, in fact, all normal politics somehow has security as a grounding. Securitization could be replaced, so we could move from one securitization to another one in which the first one then is no longer talked in those terms, but actually there is another issue that sort of replaces that first one. or securitization could be re-articulated. So in that sense, an issue indeed is no longer articulated as a security issue without something else taking its place. Or securitizations could be silenced, could be suppressed, could be it could be no longer legitimate to talk about it in those terms. Now, if we compare critical security, so the idea of security as emancipation and securitization in the sense of security as a speech act, what we see is that there are some overlaps, but there are also some differences. I've argued that while in security as human security and in security as emancipation, the human being is at the center, that in securitization, very often there are group reference. I also argue that this is not a necessity, but that most of the work has been more about how particular political group identities have been inscribed into the discourse. It is something that goes across all sectors, but of course now with a more formal definition, that's no longer the real point, I would say. It is no longer now the daily threat, because this idea of the urgency and the existential threat makes it into a sort of existential threat representation, and this reintroduces this idea that perhaps security is not something that is in the routine lives of people on a daily basis. It is not emancipatory, it's a critique of a particular presentation, but it doesn't actually lay claims to a particular emancipatory goal, if that means that emancipation is actually about providing an alternative. There's no alternative that we've talked so far about. It is all about, desecuritization and therefore opening up particular political discourses, political debates, but it's not about a particular vision for society, a particular goal to be achieved, etc. In fact, very often securitization has also been used simply in descriptive terms to look at, how security interaction has unfolded and how something has become a security issue, and for whom and how they interact, etc. And in that sense, it is not so much a universal theory now anymore. Of course, the logic of security is still assumed to be universal, but what security then substantively means can look very different in different historical and cultural contexts. It is also a theory or a conception of security that is critical, but now critical more in the sense of looking at the problematic aspects of a given construction of security, and it is critical in the sense of constituting particular realities that may have difficult or problematic political consequences. It is not critical in the sense of providing an alternative world order. Now, the concept of security as a speech act, of securitization, has been used in many different empirical works. And I'm just mentioning on this slide a few of them. Buzan and Wever themselves have looked at the securitization of terrorism, something that they see as a new kind of what they call macro securitization, replacing the old securitization of the Cold War. It has been very often, and actually in the very early works of the Copenhagen colleagues, been used to look at the ways in which migration has been constructed as a security issue. And to repeat, many talk about these days about the securitization of migration, and they talk about this even in positive terms. But of course, the original was actually a critique of that process. And it's very, very much worth going back to worthwhile going back to that original book of the 1990s, because especially today, people often seem to think that the securitization securitization of migration in the so-called migration crisis of 2015 is something specific. But if you go back and read these pieces of the 1990s, you will see that very similar processes have already been analyzed in those days. People have used securitization to understand the evolution of so-called ethnic conflict or conflict development, and you can see that I'm referring to work that I've done myself on the transformation of border conflicts through European integration. But in the analysis of these border conflicts, we've used the idea of securitization. It's been used to look at the legitimization of particular policies. A former PhD student of mine, Atsuko Higashino, wrote a very nice piece on the ways in which EU enlargement has been legitimized through securitization, through invoking the threat of the rise of nationalism in the European East, and that unraveling the whole peace order in the integrated Western Europe. Intervention, humanitarian intervention, similar kind of story, Rita Abrahamsen there. People have looked at the securitization of the environment or particular health issues such as AIDS, and this is of course very pertinent to today and the corona crisis. But one of the aspects that has come out of this is the ways in which securitization has both positive and negative consequences. So for instance, as I said earlier, that to establish something on the political agenda already requires some securitization, but then again, on the other hand, securitization leads to marginalization, and in Stefan Elbes' work about securitization of AIDS, this becomes very obvious. On the one hand, securitization made it possible to put AIDS on the agenda, to develop particular pharmaceutical products, etc. But at the same time, it also meant that those who have AIDS in many societies were being stigmatized and excluded and seen themselves as a threat. I'll get to Busan and Weber in a second, and then my own work recently, and the work of Matt MacDonald and others, has been on the securitization of climate change, and also we have argued that climate change presents a particular form of securitization, and that this distinction between politics and security, as I've already outlined, is perhaps not adequate. Now, Busan and Weber themselves have used securitization very problematically, I think, and indeed many colleagues in Copenhagen at the time also thought that this was very problematic, to delineate particular regional security complexes. The main idea was, and this was already Busan's idea in the 1980s, that security is not, as the neo-realists think and many others think, a global enterprise, but that this global idea of security is very much an effect of the Cold War, which they call an overlay that sort of subdued all other security interaction. And the idea is that once you take away that overlay, then the other security interaction that is, much more stable and much more long running comes to the fore again. And the idea there in these works is that actually, if you look at the world, that if you map the security interaction, you would then see particular regions, clusters of security interaction emerging, and they call these regional security complexes. And so if you then think that security interaction is largely through speech acts, through securitization, then you could map those securitizations, and you would see how, particular actors refer to another state as the threat, and how, there are particular clusters of these articulations of the others as threats, and that would sort of map onto the world, and you could trace security dynamics then in the ways that Busan and Weber have done, and you can see this in this map. Now, there's lots of problems with that. One, of course, is that this kind of usage of securitization strips away all the critical content. It is mostly a description, a tool, an instrument, a method, if you will, even for describing these security complexes. There are many other issues. Some of these issues have to do with the question of what the political consequences of this are. There are also issues about how you measure securitization. In fact, what they looked at was security interaction in classical terms, not in the terms of securitization, but they argued that they can look at these measures taken, because from the measures taken, they can then infer that there's had to be a securitization process. But in their own book, their earlier 1998 book, they write that the implementation of the measures is not a requirement for there to be a securitizing move. In fact, that a successful securitization can actually lead to the measure not being taken because, say, the opponent, the threat, is then therefore altering its course of action. Of course, this would be the classic idea of mutually assured destruction. Yeah? So of deterrence, you deter the other side by successful securitizing. Now, we have to very quickly now go through a number of debates that have unfolded around this concept. And as I already said, you can fill whole libraries with these issues. And the first one is whether securitization is indeed only a speech act. So clearly in the Copenhagen school, this idea of speech act has been very central. But of course it implies a particular, even decisionist understanding of politics. It is the moment that the politician speaks that something is turned into security, and many have therefore argued that this is close to a Schmittian conception of politics. And so it as I said earlier, this is maybe important for the allocation of responsibility, but it also means that the situation of the actor in a broader societal, discursive, historical context is completely ignored, or largely ignored anyway. And so there is, in this kind of argumentation, there is not a clear solution to the structure agency problem. And to cut a long story short, therefore, a lot of people have argued, as I did earlier, that we shouldn't look at the Speech Act as an individual act. We shouldn't look at the illocutionary force that this Speech Act might have. We should look at this as a broader discourse, the Speech Act as part of a broader discourse, and the Speech Act itself and the broader discourse, the context in which the Speech Act is situated, they influence each other. Likewise, Holger Stritzel, for instance, has argued that there is a problem of translation, that we need to look at the ways in which particular articulations are then taken up by audiences, and these audiences, even if they share the same culture, but even more so if the audience is a universal or global audience or whatever, there would have to be an act of translation, and therefore it cannot be the Speech Act as such. We always need to think of this in processual terms. We need to think of it in a much broader understanding of discourse. Another aspect of this issue of only being a speech act is the question about visuals. A lot of work these days, including the work of my colleague Gabi Schlag, is about the role of images, among others, in securitization. What about visualizations? You see here on the lower left corner a poster, an election campaign poster by the Christian Democrats in Germany. This poster, without engaging in speech, is clearly a securitizing move. It represents the bad Russians as an Asian empire that is presented with particularly bad dark colors to grab the shining light European West. Now, that's an articulation of existential threat. And yes, it draws on perhaps a pre-existing discourse that is textual. But then again, people who do that kind of work would argue so do individual other speech acts. They are also drawing on an existing discourse. So the argument that this picture may only make sense to us on the basis of a particular discourse may be problematic from that point of view. Or it may also be problematic because perhaps there are some emotional reactions to such a picture that are independent from a broader textual discourse. Lena Hansen's own work on this, and she was the one who very much introduced this idea of visuals as part of securitization processes, was actually on the Mohammed cartoon crisis. This was a crisis that unfolded a while back when in Denmark a particular British cartoonist for the newspaper Jyllandsposten did this cartoons that were in his view problematizing Islam. I don't think that they were particularly that he didn't really think about what the possible consequences might be, but that's a different question. The point is that these cartoons were clearly also securitizing practices. So there were visuals that transported a particular idea of an existential threat, etc. So in that sense, we would have to not focus only on speech acts, but also include, say, cartoons, visuals in our work. Lena Hansen also asked a question about silence, and she asked a question about rapes. If a woman is raped and she cannot talk about it because of the discursive boundaries in the particular context in which she lives, is that therefore not a security issue? The title of that paper, and this gets us back to the Copenhagen Little Mermaid, was The Little Mermaid's Silent Security Dilemma, of course making reference to this idea of the Copenhagen school, etc. And this is an important issue. From the perspective of Weber, Buzan and others, I suppose, indeed, the whole point of the argument is that security as a security issue on the societal level needs to be articulated. So that doesn't mean that there is a violation of the individual rights and the body of the woman who is being raped. But the point for Buzan and Weber would be to turn that into a security issue. It needs to be articulated as such. And this may have, in this case, of course, positive consequences. But, as we know from the work of Elbe on AIDS, the consequences may also be ambivalent. But this is another issue. So what about silences? What about that is not spoken? So we need to probably contextualize securitization in a broader discourse, a discourse that takes up also the interplay with the audience, a discourse that understands where securitization is coming from, and how this articulation of threats is perhaps taking different forms in different contexts, be they different policy contexts or cultural contexts or historical contexts. Another debate was about extraordinary measures. What are extraordinary measures? Now, clearly, the question is then, what is extraordinary? Are these measures extraordinary because of their nature? So is war, for instance, by its very nature, something that is extraordinary? That raises all sorts of questions about the threshold. So is now the fact that we have to wear masks, is that extraordinary? Or do you have to kill someone for something to be called extraordinary. Another possibility would be that it's extraordinary because of the political process that was necessary to agree on the measure. So are all those measures extraordinary that are not being decided on by Parliament, but because of an emergency situation by the president of a country or what have you, without further political debate. But if that's the case, that would sit a bit awkwardly with the definition that does not make reference as such to the political processes that underpin this, and in fact would argue that securitization itself is only taking that out of those political processes. Or is it about being illegitimate in other terms? I mean, this is the way that I've used it, that extraordinary measures are such measures that without securitization would have been considered illegitimate. But then, of course, the problem is that all sorts of measures become extraordinary, because most measures at some point, once they haven't been debated, have been not considered legitimate. And so they needed a legitimization for them to be considered. And this brings us back to the question of where the boundary is. And perhaps that means that the analytical sort of distinction between security and politics, that was one of the reasons why this idea of securitization was developed, is then undermined again. So that gets us again to this idea of security and politics. So we already talked about the problem that what is understood as normal politics may be a standard liberal Western democracy. So then what about non-democracy? And some of the arguments, for instance, by Yuhavori are that even there, a dictator, for instance, needs to legitimize his policies. And the audience, though, may not be the public at large. It may sometimes be elite circles, the cronies, if you will, that he deals with. A second problem is, about this relationship between securitization and politicization that I've already highlighted. So do you not need a certain degree of securitization to put things on the agenda? And then, security measures may be routinized. This is what Lena Hansen, as a desecuritization strategy, referred to as stabilization. There's a certain routinization of practices, so they become normal. Are they then not security anymore? Are they then politics? This is what Hansen implies. Or can we also see them still as a routinized form of securitization that is not yet politics? So all of these things become very, very tricky. We've also already talked about another debate, and that is about the negativity of securitization. As the example of AIDS or climate change, for that matter, illustrates, securitization may not close down. It may open up to political debate by putting something on the agenda. It may actually lead to emancipatory policies. It may be necessary to battle harmful policies or viruses, for that matter. It may, for instance, free the Little Mermaid if we articulate this as a security issue. Clearly, the women who are raped are then, measures may be taken then as a consequence of this, and this is clearly positive, isn't it? So in that sense, not all securitizations and not all aspects of securitization automatically are negative. So perhaps following Paul Rowe, we need to discuss the effects of securitization not in the abstract, but rather against concrete cases, against external normative criteria. Rita Floyd, for instance, has suggested some of these criteria for what she calls a just securitization. She argues for a securitization to be just, normally defensible, it needs to refer to an objectively existing threat. It needs to be referring to a morally legitimate referent object, and it needs to propose an appropriate response. But of course, all of these things at the same time then undermine the whole idea of securitization, which does, of course, start from the point that that the existential threat is not simply objectively given, but is turned into such a threat through the speech act. So solving this problem in a sense of negativity and positivity is always running the danger of undermining the whole conceptual foundation of the whole idea. Another argument that I also already referred to is the idea that there may be varieties of securitization. So rather than having a strict politics security distinction and having clear-cut idea of what security is, there may be differences depending on the policy field that you're working in, and many critics have argued that what Busan and Weber describe as securitization is very much modeled on traditional military security and war, and that this looks very different if we go to other policy fields. So there may be variations, and if you look at this particular graph, that is an element of the project work that we've done on the transformation of border conflicts. You could say that securitization, there could be degrees of securitization, both in terms of intensity. This is the Y dimension, and on the X dimension it could be according to the societal reach of security. That would be also a conceptualization of different varieties of security. Then there is the question of who can speak security to whom. So who is the audience? In the discussion about autocratic states, we discussed the problem that perhaps in some political configurations, it's not a larger public, but particular elites that are being addressed. Then the question is, is it always politicians? So most of the empirical work has focused on looking at debates in parliament and declarations by governmental officials, etc. But perhaps securitization. Look at the Corona crisis again. Maybe it's the virologists that are the ones who securitize and that have the authority. So maybe we need to be a lot more attentive. Maybe it's the pop stars. Maybe the film directors that are securitizing actors. And then there's also the question of the risk of analyzing securitization, because, of course, by analyzing this, you become perhaps part of this particular discourse. And this is an old argument that Jeff Huysmans made in relation to the early works of the Copenhagen School and migration, that the problem was that by looking at it critically, of course, and with critical intentions, by tracing those securitization processes, these articulations of the migrant as a security threat, you would at the same time, of course, reinforce that particular discourse, and you would give it a certain kind of importance. And so, do you therefore provide tools for those who want to legitimize extraordinary measures against migrants? Are you not taking part in this broader discourse that you want to critique? Are you not legitimizing the increasing infiltration of the military then to daily lives if you look at securitization in different policy sectors? And of course, this is a problem that is probably inescapable, but it's something to be borne in mind. Of course, every criticism always also there's a danger of reinforcing what you criticize, but it's still an issue that is at stake. And of course, by looking at how the debate evolved and how lots of people now talk about the securitization of something as a positive thing, and we ought to do this, we need to do this, this shows how the analytical value that this may have may politically be rather ambiguous. And then there's the question of emancipation, to go back to last week. So I already noted how the Copenhagen School and the idea of Security as a Speech Act is not emancipatory in the classic sense. And in fact, some people have argued, as I already also said, like Bill McSweeney has argued that it reproduces, it ontologizes these identities that it refers to as referent objects. And I've already taken a stance against this, that I don't think that this is the case. I think if you take the pedigree of the whole argument seriously, you would have to say that this is a critique of the inscription of particular identities, in the political debate. And you would also, I think, have to say that it poses a different strategy for emancipation in terms of opening up political debates rather than pursuing a particular course of action. Now, to conclude, what we see at the moment when we look at the corona crisis, we see actually a very clear-cut case of securitization. And the question is, of course, why is this so successful? And my take on this is because corona clearly was constructed as an immediate existential threat. It was substantiated by pictures of people dying, of stories of people we know or can relate to, of family stories, etc. And so it became very, very personal. It became very direct and imminent to people, and it was then also articulated by people who were seen as, by actors who were seen in this context to have authority, health ministers, but also, of course, the virologists, etc. So this clearly helped the securitization of corona. There are clear emergency measures. I don't have to go into them again. The removal of core liberties, the lockdown even in the face of economic meltdown. And very clearly this contrasts to the attempt, say, by Fridays for Future to securitize climate change, where there is an existential threat, but the existential threat is not imminent. It's not something that is visible in the strict sense of the term. We see pictures of fires and droughts, but these pictures, of course, need a translation, so to speak, in terms of long-term consequences of actions, and this becomes very complex. So it's much more difficult to articulate climate change if we compare as a security threat, as if we compare this to, say, COVID-19. There is also then visible in the current crisis the normative ambiguity. On the one hand, of course, the securitization led to necessary measures. And you can clearly see how, say, in countries where there was not so much securitization, where it was more contested, take in the beginning the United Kingdom, or for that matter, the Trump administration in the United States, and see how they have much higher numbers of deaths. And so clearly there was a positive element of the early and this clear-cut securitization, say, in Germany. Yet on the other hand, of course, we're discussing the degree to which this has limited the political debate and is a challenge for democracy. I mean, even Merkel talks about it in those terms. Yet again, on the other hand, the question then is, of course, whether or not there are certain contributions in terms of fake news and so on that really ought to be excluded. So all the ideas that this is all a conspiracy, etc., may be actually very problematic. So all of these raises very nicely these normative ambiguities of securitization in our current concrete context. I've written actually a blog post on this that you may want to have a look at, that really looks at this comparison between corona and climate security. So We've seen how securitization, security as a speech act, sees security as discursively constructed, where the discourse is focused now on speech acts as opposed to other elements of discourse. It is about a representation of an existential threat to a referent object, which in that moment is also reinscribed into the discourse, that legitimizes extraordinary policy measures. It therefore provides a formal rather than a substantive definition of security, and my argument was that this builds on academically in the internal debates on post-structuralist work, and that therefore I would read this as a critical understanding of security that sees security as a problem rather than a solution. Yet this argument is very heavily contested, as many other aspects of security as a speech act. And in particular, we've looked at critiques that were looking into the political implications and the conceptual precision of the concept. And with that, I would like to thank you for your patience today, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with you. Thank you very much.